Welcome back. So for the second talk of the morning, we have Professor Pierre P. Talking on cubulable KLMR.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizer for the invitation to come here. So this talk is about joint work with Thomas Delzan. I want to the aim of the talk is to describe a spherical compact scalar manifold which have the which are cubulable. So maybe you don't know what this means, but I will start explaining what this means in 2 minutes. So it's a notion which comes from geometric group theory, and also along the way we'll see a statement which is only about fundamental groups of compact scalar manifolds. So we will describe cubulable Keller groups. So in this talk, a Keller group means a group that can be realized as a fundamental group of a closed Keller manifold. And if you don't care about this notion of cubulability, there will be another thing which maybe is more interesting, or which I hope will be useful elsewhere. It's a new criterion to produce vibrations on two curves. Okay, so I will start by introducing these notions. So there will be no algebraic geometry, no complex geometry in the beginning. So first I have to explain what is a cubical complex. Well, it's a bit like a cubical complex, if you wish, but instead of considering simplices, we'll consider cubes. And we'll ask that the identification between faces of distinct cubes are just by isometries. Okay, so what I'll consider is just a space which is obtained by gluing cubes. It could be cubes of a distinct dimension. It could be something like this. Okay, so a formal definition is like this. So take let's say a family of cubes. So they are all isometric to 0, 1 to the n for some n. And now just consider a space which is a quotient of this disjoint union of cubes. Okay, so you can think of your space like this. And you say that X is a cubical complex if, well, you ask two conditions on the equivalence relation. First, you want each cube to inject the quotient. And two, if the images of two cubes in the quotient intersect, then it means that you have one face of the first cube and another face of the second cube, which are identified by an isometry, and that's it. There's no more identification. Okay? So maybe I'll just not write this, but I'll just say it once more. So if the images of two cubes intersect, this means that there is one face in the first cube, another face on the other cube, which are identified by an isometry, and that's it. There's no more identification. Exactly. Okay, so examples where I can take R subdivided into intervals of length 1, okay? or I can take r to the n divided into cube of unit length. And let me describe another type of examples, which is associated to a family of groups called right-angled Harting groups. So I will take a finite graph, gamma. Okay, so maybe I will number its vertices from 1 to n. And I will I will build first a space and later a group. So I will call X gamma the following subset of the n-dimensional torus. So I'll just think of the torus as 0, 1 to the n modulo the standard identification. And for this, well, first I will put all the standard edges. So I will put 0, 1 times 0, 0, 0, 0, okay? And all the edges. I mean the images of these things in the torus. So this is just like a wedge of circle inside the torus. And now, whenever I have, if I have two vertices which are adjacent, I will put a square in X gamma. So for instance, if the vertex number 1 is adjacent to the vertex number 2 in the graph, then I'll put the product 0, 1 times 0, 1, and also all the other coordinates are 0. And then if I have a k-tuple of vertices which are all pairwise adjacent, I'll put a cube of dimension k. Okay? So this was just something of dimension 1, and I will add a k-dimensional cube each time I see a k-tuple of pairwise adjacent vertices. Okay, if the first k vertices of my graph so I'm going to build a compact cubical complex. Well, it's not really a cubical complex because later what I'll do is I'll just take its inverse image in Rn. For the moment, I build it as a subset of a torus. So what I'm saying is first I put all the cubes of dimension 1, the n. Okay, just all. I think of this torus as a quotient of this cube, so all edges and the images in the torus, and give me n edges. And then each time, if I have a pair of vertices which are adjacent, I will put a two-dimensional cube. Okay, I will put the cube 0, 1 times 0, 1 with the other coordinate equal to 0 if the first two vertices are adjacent. Okay? If the first vertex is adjacent to the third, then in my X gamma I will include 0, 1 times 0 times 0, 1, etc. And then I'll continue if I see three vertices which are pairwise adjacent. Then I will put a three-dimensional cube, which correspond to the coordinates, the three coordinates corresponding to the vertices. So is it clear more or less what this X gamma is? Okay, so this is X gamma. And now so if I call pi the projection from Rn to Tn, the first thing is that the inverse image of this X gamma is naturally a cubical complex. Okay, so it's a subcomplex of Rn with its standard cubical structure. And if I'm interested in groups, so what is the fundamental group of this X gamma? This is what is called a right angle Artin group. So the fundamental group of the space, it only depends on the two-dimensional skeleton. So there's one generator for each edge. So there are n generators, which you can think of as corresponding to the vertices. And each time you glue a square, you put a relation. But if you glue a square, the relation you are imposing is just that two generators are commuting. So Gi commute with Gj if the corresponding vertices are adjacent in your finite graph. Okay, and this means Gi, Gj, Gi inverse, Gj inverse. And this complex is called the Salvetti complex of gamma. And so groups of these forms are called right angle Artin groups. Okay, so this gives a source of example of cubical complexes. Okay, so maybe now I have to define something else that I will define very quickly. So I want to define what is a non-positively curved cubical complex. So okay, so if you I will assume that all complexes are finite dimensional. This one, these guys, yes. Okay, this means that the dimension of the cube you use to build your space is bounded. And in this case, I mean, you can always. Okay, these spaces have a natural distance. Okay, what is the distance between 2 points? Well, the distance between a point x and the point y, you will measure it like this. You will consider a path made of finitely many pieces, each piece being contained in a cube. And you measure the distance between these points in the cube. And so you take the sum of these distances, and then you take the infimum over all chains. Okay, and this distance, it's nice, it's complete geodesic if you have a finite dimensional space. And now there is a notion of non-positive curvature for these spaces, which is defined in terms of the convexity property of this distance. It's the cat-zero property, if you know what this means. So I will not really write this definition. So, but I will tell you one equivalent criterion. So a cubical complex is non-positively curved. If its natural distance satisfies locally or globally, if it's simply connected, locally the cat-zero inequality. So I will not really define this. But I will tell you an equivalent criterion. So it's a theorem of Gromov that this is equivalent to this convexity property of the distance. It's equivalent to a property that you can really check combinatorially on your complex, because otherwise, if you did not have this theorem of Gromov, it would be hard to check that a complex is not positively curved. But this theorem that I'll state, it gives you a concrete way to check this condition. So to state the theorem, I need one definition. So if I have a vertex in a cubical complex, I can define its link, which is a graph. So what is the link of a vertex? So for each, so I will define what is the link of this vertex. So for each edge starting from this vertex, I will put a point. If I have a square, here I will put an edge from this, between these 2 points. Okay, so here I'll have 3 edges like this. There is also another vertex on the back. And here, since I have a 3-dimensional cube, I will put a triangle between these 3 points. Okay? Okay, so for each, so this yellow thing is the link of this point, and it's a simplicial complex. Okay? So each k-dimensional cube gives you a k-1 dimensional simplex in the link. And now the theorem of Gromov says that X, a complex X is non-positively curved. I'll just write NPC. If and only if all links are flag complexes. Okay, so I need to define what this means. And what does this mean? It means that a simplicial complex is a flag complex if it's determined by its one skeleton, meaning whenever you have k vertices which are pairwise adjacent, then you have a k simplex. You have the corresponding k simplex. So, whenever k vertices are pairwise adjacent, then they are part of a k simplex, okay, a k-dimensional simplex. So what does this mean in terms of the cubical complex? It means, for instance, that if I want a cubical complex to be non-positively curved, it means that if I have 3 squares like this, it means that in the link of this point I have 3 edges, and I need to have the triangle. So I need to have the 3-dimensional cube if I wanted to satisfy this condition. Okay? And so this is a condition that you can check concretely on example of complexes. Okay, so now just one definition. So when I'll consider groups acting on cubical complexes. So if I have a group which acts on a cubical complex, it's implicit that the action should respect the cubical structure, okay? The element of the group send one cube to another cube isometrically. So first, some vocabulary. I'll say that a group is cube level if it acts, if it admits an action on a cat0 cubical complex. Co-compactly and properly, geometrically, meaning co-compactly and properly discontinuously. And so the interest in this notion in the last years in geometric group theory is that there have been an increasing quantity of examples of groups which are known to have this property. And there are many nice properties that you can deduce from the existence of such actions. So examples of such groups. So okay, abelian groups, which the n acts on Rn by translation. It preserves the cubical structure I described before. Surface groups, meaning fundamental groups of closed Riemann surfaces. I mean, closed orientable surfaces. I don't really need them to be Riemann surfaces for the moment. Okay, we'll continue here. So this is not very difficult to prove. Something much more important, so which is obtained combining works of Jan Markovich and Bergeon and Wise, is that if you take any closed hyperbolic three manifold, then its fundamental group, it's always, maybe up to taking a finite index subgroup, it's always cubulable. Okay, so the fundamental group of M has a finite index subgroup, which is cubulable. Okay, and this was used to prove many conjecture about hyperbolic three manifolds. Okay, so I will not say much more for the moment, and there are many other examples. So there are many Coxeter groups which are cubulables, or virtually, because we don't really care in this situation about taking finite index subgroups, etc. Okay, I will not give more examples for the moment, but so this is really an important topic in geometric group theory. And so the question I want to discuss is what about fundamental groups of, let's say, smooth projective manifold or closed scalar manifolds? Okay, so maybe I'll write the theorems here. So of course, if you have a group which is cubulable, I mean, the condition of being cubulable, it's stable by taking direct products, because if you have you can do direct products of cubical complexes. So I can look at Riemann surfaces or tori or products. It will give me examples of Kähler manifolds with cubulable fundamental groups. And the theorem we prove is that essentially it's the only thing that can happen. So if gamma is the fundamental group of a compact Kähler manifold, and if gamma is cubulable, then up to taking a finite index subgroup, so then there exists a subgroup gamma not in gamma of finite index, such that, well, gamma naught is isomorphic to a direct product of a free abelian group of even rank and a product of fundamental group of closed surfaces. Okay? So this is the first result. Okay, I will leave the space. I'll write this here. And now you can ask, what can I say about if gamma is the fundamental group of Z with Z compact scalar, what can you say about Z itself? Okay. So, well, in general, you cannot say anything if you. Well, yeah, actually, you can say something. But you cannot say. You cannot completely describe Z if you don't make an additional assumption, because you don't have something. You only have a condition on pi1. But now, if you assume that Z is aspherical, meaning that its universal cover is contractible, then its homotopy type depends only on gamma. Z is k gamma 1. And then you have the following theorem. So here I will assume that X is projective because there is a slightly nicer statement in this case. But a bit later I will also explain what happens for the Kähler case. So assume that Z is smooth projective. Okay, I don't write smooth. Aspherical, so this means that its universal cover is contractible. And that its pi1 is cubable. And then the conclusion is that you can take a finite covering space of Z, so there exists Z naught, such that Z naught is biholomorphic to a product of an abelian variety and finitely many Riemann surfaces. Okay? Here, it's isomorphic. Yeah. Well, anyway, if you have something of finite index in this group, anyway, it will contain something maybe of bigger index, but also finite, which is itself a direct product. Okay, so before stating a third theorem, maybe I can explain how you pass from A to B, because this has nothing to do with cubical complexes or geometric group theory or whatever. So why A implies B? And in doing this, we'll see what is we'll see the proof, and we'll see what happens if Z is only Kähler and where we use projective, which is only at one point. So I take Z like this, maybe only Kähler, and I will see why I need projective. So according to the first theorem, to theorem A, so there exists a first, I can take a first finite covering space whose fundamental group is a product. And now, okay, so now I can consider the projection from this group onto the surface groups. Okay, I can assume that these things are of higher genus, of genus at least 2. Otherwise, pi1 is Z2, and I'll put it in this factor. So this projection for any J, this projection. Well, we know what its kernel is. It's just a direct product of all these factors minus. I just remove one factor. So in particular, the kernel, it's finitely generated. I mean, it's much more than that. We know what it is, but this thing has a finitely generated kernel. Okay, and now it's a classical theorem. It appears in a paper of Catanese. Maybe it's, I don't know, other people knew it in Nepal, I don't know. But if you have a closed scalar manifold on a morphism like this with finitely generated kernels, then you can realize it by a holomorphic map. You can find a Riemann surface and a holomorphic map which induces this on pi1. Okay, so there exists a complex structure. On sigma j, and the holomorphic map fj, such that at the level of fundamental group, fj induces this projection. Okay, so now what you can do, you have Z1, and so now you have a holomorphic map to this product of Riemann surfaces. Okay? And now you will look at the Albanese variety of Z1, so you have a map like this. And here you have the Albanese variety of the Jacobian of these curves. And you have a map like this, which makes the diagram commutative. And okay, this is an embedding. So what I'll consider is just the submanifold of A, which is just the inverse image on this map of the product of Riemann surfaces. Okay, so I don't know, I will call this phi. So these Riemann surfaces, I will think of them as embedded here. And this is just a point of A such that phi of A is in sigma 1 times sigma. Okay. And by definition, this vertical map maps Z1 into Y. So I don't know this. I don't know, I'll call this pi. So pi of Z1 is contained in Y. So I will decompose pi as a, I don't know, a capital phi times the inclusion. Okay? And now the claim is actually that Z1 is biholomorphic to this. And this, so first thing is that this map, just in the same infinity category, actually you can trivialize it. You can write A as a product of a torus. You can find a diffeomorphism from A to a product of a torus B times A1 times AR, so that you see that topologically this is just a product. I mean, from the infinity point of view, this is a product of a torus times a product of Riemann surfaces. And holomorphically, it's just a torus bundle of a product of Riemann surfaces. And the claim is that phi is an isomorphism. Okay, and how do you prove this? You have to prove that phi is an isomorphism on pi1. You have to prove that it induces an isomorphism on fundamental groups. And I will not really explain this, but it's not difficult. It's just a little bit of group theory. And then you are more or less done, because these two things, this is aspherical by hypothesis. This is aspherical because, as I said, you can prove that it's infinity diffeomorphic to a product of a torus and Riemann surfaces. And now you have a holomorphic map, which is, you have two aspherical manifolds. You have a map which induces an isomorphism on pi1, so it must be a homotopy equivalent. And that's it. So you have a holomorphic map which is of degree 1, which is a homotopy equivalent, so it cannot contract anything, so it must be biholomorphic. So this is not a new argument, it's used by by Sue or by other people. So the second step you use is that if a holomorphic map between two compact scalar manifolds is a homotopy equivalence, then it is a biholomorphism. Okay, so the conclusion of theorem B in the Keller case is that your manifold is biholomorphic to a torus bundle of a product. And the only thing you need to say when Z is projective is just to use Poincaré's reducibility theorem to see that maybe you have to take another finite cover, but the Poincaré theorem will tell you that this is virtually a product, and then everything will work. Maybe you have to replace these Riemann surfaces by finite cover. I mean, maybe you have to take finite covers everywhere, but at the end you really have that Z is virtually a product in the holomorphic category. Okay, so this is the proof of theorem B. Okay, I don't know how much I'll have time to say about theorem A, but before discussing possibly discussing the proof of theorem A, I want to explain the third result, which we use to establish theorem A. So there are many theorems, many criterion in the literature to, when you have a compact scalar manifold, to produce a fibration onto a curve. Okay, maybe the most famous one is the Castelnuovo de Franchis theorem. Okay, it says that if you have X compact scalar, and if you have two holomorphic one forms, which are independent, and whose cup product is 0, then X values, okay? And the forms are pullbacks of forms on the curve. Okay, so there are many variations on this criterion. So maybe one thing that I want to recall, which is maybe less known, because it deals with infinite covers. So one thing I want to recall, it's something more or less folkloric among people working on fundamental groups of Keller manifolds. It's appeared in the work of Napier and Ramachandran, Dels and Gromov, is that if you take a compact scalar manifold, and now you take an infinite covering space, okay? And assume that this thing properly fibers over a Riemann surface. So you have a proper holomorphic map onto a Riemann surface. I'll call it pi. So this is a proper fibration. Okay, so I need to put the word proper. Then in this context, it is automatic that pi descend to a finite cover. Maybe not to X, but it will automatically descend to a finite cover of X. So it will induce a vibration on a closed thing. So if you want, I can give you the proof. So what is nice is that it's true in this generality. I don't have to assume anything else on X1, but if the infinite covering space is Galois, I can give you the proof. Otherwise, it's a bit more complicated. But the proof when it's a Galois covering, it's really easy. Okay, so this is the sigma, I don't know. And this is, what's his name? X1. So if it's Galois, it means that I have a group acting here. So I take a fiber, and I take its image under an element of the group. So if the image of the fiber under an element of the group is like this, since it's proper, it will project to a non-trivial analytic set in an open Riemann surface, but this is not possible. It must be a point. I assume that the fibers are connected. Okay, so if it's a point, it means that the group preserves the fibers and it descends. And then if it's not Galois, you have to work more, but it's true. Okay, but at least you have an idea of why it's true for Galois covering. And so since we have this, well, we know that if we look at proper fibration on two Riemann surfaces for infinite covering, it will still give information about compact spaces, I mean finite covering spaces of X. So once I've said that, I can say that I'm there also, for instance, L2 version of this, if you have two holomorphic forms which are L2 on an infinite covering space and whose cup product is zeros and you have a fibration. There are many refinements on L2 version of the theorem by Napi and Ramachandran. Okay, so I'll just mention this. Okay, now I will call this theorem C. So you want to state another criterion. So I will be in the situation. I have a closed scalar manifold and I consider an infinite covering space. And I will give a criterion for this X1 to fibers. So it's a bit like in Castelnuovo de Franquis, I will need two objects on X1, but the nature of these objects will be a bit different. So the first thing I need is that there exists a map to 1 or 0, 1 as you wish, which is pluriharmonic. So this means it's locally the real part of a holomorphic function. And I need it to be proper, so this is a bit annoying, but okay. Okay, so this is my first object. And the second thing I need is another function. And this function phi, I only need it to be plurisubharmonic. But I mean continuous. Okay, we are doing topology. It's not a plurisubharmonic function of the analyst, so it's continuous plurisubharmonic plus I need some kind of condition of independence, and the condition is that phi is not a function of u. Okay, I can always build such a phi by composing u with a convex function or something else. And the conclusion is that under this hypothesis, X1 properly fibers. Okay, so this is a tool in the proof of theorem A. I will explain the proof of this because it's quite nice. And maybe I won't have time to say more about theorem A, but we'll see. So the first step, I will not explain the details, but the first step is if you have such a U which has a level set which is not connected, you are done and you don't even need the second function. If some level set of U is not connected, X1 fibers. So this is a bit like there's a classical theorem of Simpson, saying that if you have a holomorphic or harmonic one form on a closed scalar manifold, you take a covering spaces where it's exact, and if the level set of the primitive on these covering spaces are not connected, if some of this level set is not connected, then there is a fibration of the original manifold. So here it's a bit like this, except that we are not in an equivariant context. This U, it's not, its differential does not necessarily comes from X1. So it's a bit like Simpson theorem, but it's not equivariant. So I will not discuss the proof of this, but now I will prove this assuming that U has connected level set. And here I will. Okay. So what you do is that you consider the possibly singular foliation defined by the 1-0 part of the differential of U. Okay, so U, it's locally the real part of a holomorphic function. So this 1-0 part of the differential of U, it's a holomorphic one form, and you can consider the foliation defined by the level set of a primitive locally. Maybe there are singularities. And so another fact that I will use is that if you can prove that this foliation has one compact leaf, then it's a fibration. This is also classical, so it is enough to find one compact leaf for F. Then you use a compactness result for cycles, etc. to prove that all leaves are compact and that actually you have a fibration. But this is not new, so this is not the point I want to insist on. Okay, so I'll do the same picture as before. I have, no, this is not a Riemann surface. I don't have the Riemann surface yet. I have a line or an interval. I have U, and this is X1. Okay, and I have the level set of X1. So they are connected, and I know that phi is not a function of U. So this means that there is one level set on which phi is not constant. And I can always assume that it's a regular level set by Sard's theorem. So pick a value t naught, such that t naught is a regular value of U. And phi is not constant on the inverse on this level set. Okay, and so the foliation associated to the 1-0 part of U, it leaves this hypersurface invariant. So I will just consider, so here I have a real codimension 1 foliation, and now I will only work in this fiber. I'll find a compact leaf here, and it will be enough. Okay? So the point that the restriction of F to this, so what does it mean that you have being tangent to the foliation? It means that you are in, well, you are in the kernel of du 1-0. But if you are tangent to this manifold, you are already in the kernel of du. So this, if you restrict to this manifold, this is defined by dcu. Okay, if you take a tangent vector here, you want to know if it's tangent to the foliation. You already know that it's in the kernel of du, so you only need it to be in the kernel of this. So this I will call it, I don't know. Well, and what is this? Well, this is a closed one form, closed because U is pluriharmonic. And it's non-singular. Even restricted to this, it's non-singular because this is just linear, I mean, because I'm assuming I have a regular level and it's non-singular restricted to the hyperspace, this is just a linear algebra. And now if you have a, this is, I don't know the name, it's just a translation of the fact that if you have a subgroup of R is dense or it's cyclic, if you have on a closed real manifold, if you have a foliation defined by a closed one form which is non-singular, either it's a fibration on the circle or all leaves are dense. So I want to prove that this foliation has a leaf which is not dense. And if I do this, then all leaves are compact, so I have compact leaves, and they are leaves of the original foliation. So I'm happy. So the problem is to prove that this foliation has a non-dense okay, and if I do this, it implies that all leaves here are compact. So, and now I need to use the second function because I didn't use it so far. So I will just take a point P here, such that phi of P is the maximum of phi on this level. And I claim that the leaf through P cannot be dense. Why? Because the maximum principle, so I will call LP the leaf through P. So I can, I apply the maximum principle to the restriction of phi to the leaf. So I have a local maximum, so it's constant. Okay, so the leaf is contained in a level set of phi. So it's contained in this closed set, but I assume that phi was not constant on this level. So this closed set is a proper subset of the level set of U, so this cannot be dense. And so I'm done. And so this is the proof of by the maximum principle. So phi is plurisubharmonic, LP is a complex submanifold. And so the point is that this is compact, this level of U, and the leaf is contained in it, and I choose P to be a point where phi reaches its maximum on this compact real submanifold. But now this real submanifold, it contains the leaves which are complex. So if do you agree? And well, okay. So this is the proof of theorem C. So now I don't think I really have time to embark in the proof of theorem A. So maybe I will just say one word. So in the proof of theorem, well, there are many things to say, so I don't really know where to start. So to prove theorem A, first, if you have a cubical complex, there is a notion of being irreducible. So you start by decomposing your complex into irreducible factor. And what you prove that each irreducible factor will produce either a morphism from your group to Z or to a surface group. And I'll just say a word about how we use this. So the second function, I will not say how we produce it because it's a bit too long. But the first function, it will, when you have a group, you have a compact manifold, and its pi 1 act on a cubical complex. It's relatively easy to produce covering spaces of X which have at least 2 ends. So what we'll do is to produce a covering spaces which has at least 2 ends. So there's a compact set which disconnect your manifold. And also we can arrange using a dynamical argument on the group action for this covering space to satisfy a linear isoperimetric inequality. And now what we use is a classical theorem of Riemannian geometry, that if you have a manifold which has at least 2 ends, and you have a partition of its space of ends into 2 open sets. Let's say that, and if the manifold is, let's say, a covering space of a compact manifold, it's satisfies a linear isoperimetric inequality, then you can build a harmonic function of finite energy, which tends to 1 on one open set of ends and -1 on the other one. And this harmonic function will play the role of this function. And in the Kähler case, this harmonic function is automatically pluriharmonic because it has finite energy. So I think I don't have time to say more about theorem A, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.